come on up. All right. Good morning, everyone. Slightly lesser crowd. I guess, it's Friday, it's cold, or we got the true diehards here this morning. Look, it is a pleasure to be here with you all. We are in the full swing of things. We're in the full week. It really feels like session is now up upon us. We've seen a flurry of bill requests. Some of you all may have heard we had a record number of bill requests last week at the end of the week. Going into the weekend. And I do just want to take a quick moment to thank our incredible Department of Legislative Services. We have some of the most talented professionals in the state of Maryland who we are able to rely upon, who give us the expertise that they are able to offer to draft legislation, to help us with amendments, and the amount of work that they have in a time-limited 90-day session is just Herculean. And so they, year after year after year, always perform exceedingly well. And so I just want to say thank you to them, because we are in this period where we have record number of bills. I think it's about 2,400 bills having been requested, about 700 of which were requested in the last 24 hours before the deadline for guaranteed introduction date. So that means we're going to have a busy end of February and March. A lot of bill hearings. Every bill gets a hearing if dropped on time. And so it's something that we're thinking about as we consider the schedule moving forward through the 90 days. I'm so thrilled to have our two new standing committee chairs here with us today. We have the chair of the Finance Committee, Melanie Griffith from Prince George's County, who is, has moved from our President Pro Tem position into the chair of Finance and is doing an exceptional job leading this new committee. And she will talk about a number of the major issues that will be coming through the Finance Committee. And then, of course, our Senator Brian Feldman, who is the chair of our Education, Energy, and the Environment Committee, our new jurisdiction committee, which has been, so far incredibly well situated to take on some of the most pressing challenges that we have, from climate change to energy regulation to education. It's going to be a great year, and I think the first 2 weeks have really demonstrated that we're in a very good place with these new leaders and these two new committees. One other big note is that we had our first bill on the floor yesterday, which was the 988 bill, and it was no coincidence. This is Senate Bill 3. It's our President Pro Tem, Malcolm Augustine's bill about setting up and establishing Maryland's 988 system. This is unbelievably important in this post-pandemic period, as we all are thinking through the impacts of COVID on our mental health, not just our physical health, but our mental health as well. Setting up a structure to ensure that Marylanders can pick up the phone, dial 988, and get the services they need for themselves or a loved one, or just a neighbor, or somebody that's in the community that needs help. Having this system will be incredibly important and impactful, and this is an important bill for the state of Maryland moving forward, and it's the first bill we tackled in this 2023 session. It's going to be a long rollout to get this done well, but it will be done the right way, and it's something that I think is incredibly important. So without further ado, let me hand it over to our chair of the Finance Committee, Melanie Griffith, for update on major issues.
Thank you, President Ferguson, and thank you for the appointment as chair of Senate Finance. Most of you probably know the Senate Finance Committee is virtually a different committee than the committee that met last session, in that 6 of the members are veterans to the subject matter that the committee has retained, but 5 of the members are new. 3 have transferred from other committees, and 2 are new to the Maryland Senate. So we're embracing the new subject matter and the work in front of us with enthusiasm. We started the session with a couple of pretty robust discussions around some of the subject matter that the committee will address, some new to all of the members of the committee, and some that the committee members had some background in. There are a couple of major issues that we expect the committee to work with this session. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation about the framework for the cannabis legalization and implementation, so that's something the committee expects to work on, that framework. Lots of conversation in the committee about behavioral health. As the president mentioned, the 988 bill, which came out of Budget and Taxes, on the floor, but there are efforts to improve access to behavioral health care and for people to find suitable places to receive care, particularly those that have complex needs. We also will take up discussions around minimum wage and sort of refining the paid family leave program. We expect to see legislation addressing that. Lots of conversation, even in our briefings last week, about issues that impact the healthcare workforce. We have been talking with our health occupations boards and dealing with issues about interstate compacts and how enforcement will be enacted between states where we have reciprocity for licensure. So that's something we expect the committee to hear multiple proposals on this session. And I'll also mention we are having conversations on telehealth. We have, as you know, the General Assembly adopted a preserved telehealth bill in 2021 that actually was scheduled to sunset at the end of this fiscal year. So we expect proposals that will have us look at the elements of that proposal and consider a report that came out from the Healthcare Commission on how to extend that program and what makes sense to make sure that we continue to meet the needs of Marylanders. And obviously, we'll have conversations about the protection of reproductive rights. There are conversations and proposals that will talk about how we protect the providers who provide that care and to protect the privacy of women who receive that care. So with that, Mr. President, I'll pause. I think I've said enough for now, and I'll move over and turn the podium over to my colleague.
Sure, well, like Chair Griffith, you know, the committee has got a new name, the Education, Energy, and Environment Committee. We've got a lot of new members, but it's a great mix. You know, I've talked to every one of the members before we got going, and everybody is super excited about the new jurisdiction, particularly the energy policy stuff that we brought over from the Finance Committee. You know, just big picture, if I might just lay out a couple issues. And I'll start with Governor Moore's inauguration speech last week, where he's talked about clean energy not just being part of the future Maryland economy, it's actually going to define the future Maryland economy. And I think the committee, even those who have not been involved in energy policy, are very, very excited about tackling that issue. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act money, there is $370 billion flowing down to the states in the clean energy space. And I think it's those states that are going to put policies in place that are the right kinds of policies are going to be the states that are the big beneficiaries of all that federal largesse. Some of that money is going to be formulaic. It's just going to get doled out to the states, but a lot of it's going to be competitive. And I've already, Senate President, we've had some conversations with some folks at the White House talking about the competitive aspects of some of the grants flowing from the feds and what can we do even this session to put some things in place that will be good for the environment, but also good for our economy, because there's tremendous upside economic potential for our state in the clean energy space. So I think that's going to be a big topic. We're going to have big bills dealing with offshore wind and a whole range of other things involving solar energy and the like. And the other issue is going to be in the education space. We've obviously made a huge commitment to Kirwan, but also higher ed. We had a briefing just yesterday with the chancellor of our university system talking about how to educate the future workforce of Maryland. And so that also ties into economic development. Unless you have an educated workforce, you're not going to do big things. And one of the areas that Maryland has lagged, and we had a briefing from Governor Moore last week, is we are lagging some of our peer group in terms of GDP, economic growth, and these things tie very nicely. Where are the future jobs in the country, in the nation? How can we benefit from the federal dollars flowing down? And then in order to take full advantage, we have to have a highly educated workforce, both K through 12 and higher ed. So I look forward, and by the way, these are some issues that are relatively new for me and several members of the committee. We're going to have a briefing on Kirwan. Yesterday was higher ed. Last week we had the state superintendent of schools. And so, and we're going to next week do briefings from our Public Service Commission, because again, the energy issues are new to a number of the members. So we're having a lot of briefings. We're rolling out. We actually passed our first bills out of the committee last night, so we'll have a couple of bills on the floor and to kind of exercise the muscle. But I'm super jazzed up, and the committee's super jazzed up to do some big things this session. So thank you, Mr. President.
All right, let's open it on up. Yes.
I have a question for Madam Chair. what is the status of the cannabis marketplace legislation? I haven't seen it. Is there a bill and a hearing scheduled on that?
Right, so last week, we had a briefing on the medicinal cannabis. I think it was last week, might have been the week before. We don't yet have a bill in front of us. There has been a work group that President Ferguson and Speaker Jones put together that has members from both chambers that have been working on hearing briefings and putting together some of the elements. We expect the bill to be coming out soon, but we don't have it in front of us yet.
Chair Griffith, and maybe also Senate President Ferguson, last session, the House passed the constitutional amendment for reproductive rights, and it didn't make it to the floor in the Senate. Should that bill come back this year, do you anticipate having it come to the floor and its passage?
Well, I'll start by saying the committee hasn't yet. We have a new committee, as I mentioned, that's put together from new members. But I can say the conversations around reproductive rights have been around for a long time, and many committee members have expressed interest in that conversation. Where it will go yet, I don't know that we can predict because we haven't had the conversation in committee. I don't know if the president wants to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we, I don't want to preempt in any way what would happen in the committee. It's with new committees. It's, we're going to make sure the issues are fresh. I feel confident that if we put something before the committee, that the votes will be there to get it to the floor, and I believe the votes are there on the floor to pass it, but we'll have to see as things move forward.
Senator Belvin?
Yes.
Can you tell us more about the conversations that you've had with the White House about the infrastructure bill?
Well, I think a lot of states, because as I say, the Inflation Reduction Act has $370 billion, and I think there are some folks who know people that are managing the Inflation Reduction Act dollars. Again, a lot of it's going to be doled out by population and things of that nature. What I'm most interested in is some of the competitive grant dollars, and I don't have concrete with specificity, exactly what is being looked at that would put us in the best position possible. I guess I'm really hung up and focused like a laser beam on what can we do now to position ourselves relative to other states, and so I think it's still a little bit early on. And the feedback so far has been still a bit vague, but I'm hoping that we'll get some clarity sooner rather than later. And again, it's a big commitment by the United States Congress in this space, and I think we're incredibly well positioned to take full advantage of it. But I think we got to be smart about it, and so that's really the best I can offer right now. So.
Okay. On this one, I just want to add really briefly, one of the things that I think is going to be very exciting, especially for the state of Maryland, is about the Port of Baltimore and some of the dollars that are available for transitioning port technologies. I mean, we are a state that has benefited from industry enormously. Of course, industry has largely been a coal-powered or energy-generated success story. And so as that transition has to happen, places like the Port of Baltimore, I think, are well situated with the federal dollars, and the committee will certainly be able to help navigate this to transition those diesel trucks to electric trucks and trying to find ways to reduce emissions for the port operations. I think that's really, it's a place where we can be one of the most competitive places on the globe.
Speaking of federal dollars, DLS gave a presentation yesterday about a lot of the aid that has come, pandemic aid, even going back to the American Recovery Act money, some of which hasn't even been budgeted. What's the issue there? Is it complexities? Is it strings? Is it there's time frame to spend the money down the road? And can you answer that question? And can you also say, is there going to be a move to try and move some of that money into budgeting this year?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It actually speaks directly to what the chair of our E&E committee was mentioning. A lot of these federal dollars, we know the state will get through a categorical funding model. However, it still will require a plan. And if that plan hasn't been put together yet by the executive agencies, at times the money has not been recognized in the budget. Additionally, there will be a number of programs where the state will have to match dollars in order to access the federal dollars. So there are a significant fund balance. I think it's $840 million in fund balance. I imagine some of that is contemplated as match money for federal dollars that could come down the line. One of the things that we are having a conversation about as a legislature is how can we make sure that the legislative branch is a part of all of the conversations about how these federal dollars are being used. And so as we think about transitioning from green energy, from ARPA, from kind of investments in our small businesses. In each of the committees, we have the expertise of how the state of Maryland and Marylanders can benefit. And so we are thinking about the structures and the right policy so that in session, but also outside of session, we are well situated to collaborate on how these federal dollars can be utilized to their maximum extent.
Chairman Feldman, during the interim, there was some discussion by the Maryland Energy Administration and others concerns about the state not being fully ready to move the grid to renewable electric. A lot of this centered around storage and
Right.
so what's the state need to do to get ready to go to that type of
I
system?
mean, it's a great question because we're trying to electrify everything from EVs to buildings, and yet the grid to support that, the capacity's not there. And so, in fact, I had some legislation with Delegate Charkoudian last session, but there's actually, again, a lot of money on that front. In the Inflation Reduction Act and in the infrastructure bill from last year to modernize our transmission grid, which we're going to need to do if we're going to do all these great policies that we would like to do and have already done. And so they're tied pretty closely together. And so I had the Public Service Commission Chair Stanek in my office just yesterday. And we talked about some of these things. There's a role for the Public Service Commission. This is not entirely a legislative issue. You need our regulator to be on board. And so there's a lot of moving parts of it. But at the end of the day, we've got to modernize our grid. In fact, next week at the briefing on Tuesday in front of the committee, we're not only having the Public Service Commission, we're bringing folks down from the PJM grid. The PJM folks are going to come down. We're part of a 13-state grid, and so we have to partner with PJM, 12 other states, because this is all tied together, the transmission infrastructure. So we're going to hear a little bit about that on Tuesday in the committee. So it's a great question. It's an important question. The country is grappling with it because it's a national issue. We've got a lot of energy generation in the Midwest that can't currently in the United States get to the East Coast. If we do offshore wind, how do you get the energy from offshore on land? These are some of the things we're going to grapple with. These are important issues, but they're necessary for us to address in a really smart way.
Do any states have a handle on this? Is there a roadmap to getting Maryland there?
I don't think any places, I'd like us to be the leader in the country. And candidly, I think we have a great shot for political reasons, where we're located. I talk about offshore wind. Well, not everywhere in the United States has the ability to do that. And I say, I think politically, we've got everything, I think, in place with the governor who's talking about this issue. As I mentioned earlier, we've got folks in the executive branch, new cabinet secretaries who are very supportive of everything I'm talking about. So I think we've aligned finally. The last 8 years has been a bit of a challenge. You talk about Maryland Energy Administration. Well, during the Hogan years, MEA was essentially gutted. And now I think it's part of our job is to build up some of these executive branch agencies like that one under former Senator Pinsky is going to be heading that. So this is all, I think, all hands on deck operation. But no, I don't think any state has nailed it yet, but I'd like us to be at the top of the food chain on that front.
Do you expect legislation to get the state started this session?
I think we're going to have,
Where might that start?
I think we're having likely going to have bills on all those fronts. And there's also the Climate Solutions Act itself laid out some framework on transmission upgrades and the like. But I think this federal largesse investment, I think, is potentially a key to take us up to a different level in this state and in this region and the whole PJM grid, as I mentioned earlier.
Mr. President, MCAP scores, math scores came out this week finally. 7% proficiency in Baltimore City. Before the start of the session, we had a conversation about a proposal that you had in mind to increase tutoring by extending school days or hours, et cetera, et cetera. What is the status of that proposal?
So the bill actually, I think, will be read across today. That it was dropped it in the hopper last night. Look, this is an existential crisis for the state of Maryland. We have experienced, like most states and like the globe, over the last 2 years when as a result of the pandemic, as a result of virtual learning, everyone was trying their best, but I think we all realized and learned that it wasn't sufficient. And so our children have fallen behind, not just academically, but socially and emotionally. And it is an urgent priority for us to make sure that kids have the time and investment so that they can be their best selves. That's going to take additional investments like we've been doing with the blueprint, but also thinking creatively about new opportunities. And that's what this bill will allow some schools across the state to serve as pilots for what extended days and extended years could look like for schools where we've seen the greatest amount of learning loss. I mean, the data is obvious. Objectively, we have got to do better. And it's not just about doing the same things over and over again. We have to increase the amount of quality instruction time and invest in our children. And so that's the opportunity ahead.
Any other questions?
All right.
Well, this has come up before in this setting here. Ivan Bates has been to Annapolis a couple of times already, pushing legislation he thinks would be helpful to fight crime, declaring illegal gun possession, bumping it from a misdemeanor to a felony, and extending jail time for those 21 and older from 3 years to 5 years. Not a minimum mandatory, but just an extension of that. This morning, Congressman Nfume lent his support to the bill and said he'd come down to Annapolis to testify in favor of it. Will the Senate, and it also now has a House sponsor, will the Senate entertain the bill coming over from the House?
Look, we will entertain any piece of legislation that's before us. We've in fact passed in the enhanced penalties in places previously in prior sessions. Will we pass? I can't predetermine one way or the other. I think every single member of the Senate is extremely concerned about violence across the state of Maryland. I think we are open to every conversation for what tools are necessary in order to create safe communities. We also know it must be part of a broader plan. So this one proposal is not a fix-all. It may enhance things. It may improve situations for enhancing criminal justice when there is a conviction and that there is some level of a deterrent effect. But what we know is that it takes prevention, intervention, real investment in justice, and rehabilitation. All four pillars have to be addressed. And so, yes, we will entertain it, but we have to think about the problem of safety comprehensively. It's not about one policy proposal over another. And actually, this is a bit of an aside, but I noticed our chair of our Executive Nominations Committee has joined us here today. We will have our first Executive Nominations Committee hearing on Monday at 5 o'clock. We'll be taking up the judges. We have a new chair of the Executive Nominations Committee, and she has already done and will continue to do a phenomenal job. Really, it's an important position this year because we are rebuilding government. And as we have new secretaries, we have new appointments across the board, the Executive Nominations Committee is one of our most important duties in the Senate of confirming these individuals. And so we will have a lot of confirmations ahead. I'm sure we'll have a lot of conversations here about those confirmations, but we'll kick off the year on Monday at 5.
Mr. President, that's a great segue into my next question.
Wonderful. I'm glad I'm reminded.
On Tuesday, we had sort of general discussions about the appointment of a transportation secretary. We now know the name of that secretary. I'll ask you again, do you have specific concerns about Paul Wiedefeld's track record at WMATA, specifically as it pertains to the audits that were done on the safety of the system during his tenure there as CEO?
Look, I think we have to dive into the details of every appointee, their experience, their background, their history. I've seen some very, very positive reports about the experience that the new secretary, their nominated transportation secretary, I think I've heard from other members that they've had great interactions and relationships with him over the past, his work at the Maryland Aviation Administration, and at MDOT previously. I think it's a positive thing that he has that MDOT experience. He knows the unique nature of our transportation department that has all of the different modes within it. It's very, very complicated. But of course, we'll vet him fully. We will do the full review, and if there are any questions, we will have those conversations directly with him. I've not had a chance to sit down with him yet one-on-one, but intend to do so, and also encourage all of the other members to do so, as well as through the confirmation process in our committees.
I'll simplify my question. Do you have specific concerns about that track record?
Nothing that I feel is disqualifying in any way. I want to make sure that I understand his full scope of his background and history. I'm overall feel very positively about him. I've heard great things. I've met him certainly many times in the past, but have never worked on projects together. So I can't. I look forward to getting to know him better as we move forward, because right now, I mean, investments in transportation are going to be one of the most important priorities that the state of Maryland has. And so the transportation secretary is an incredibly important role. And I am very confident in the Moore administration's vetting. They have done a phenomenal job of attracting great people thus far. And so I feel comfortable moving forward, and of course, look forward to the conversations with the nominated secretary.
President Ferguson, to pivot back to guns, I understand that, and the Bruin decision specifically. I understand that Vice Chair Waldstreicher has introduced a handful of bills that target that specifically. To my knowledge, I haven't checked this morning, but to my knowledge, they haven't been cross-filed in the House. Have there been conversations with members of the House in regard to what Maryland's policy should look like moving forward? Have you, or has there been any attempt to, I guess, bridge the gap?
Yes, they're having conversations. I suspect there will be House bills. This is a really tough issue because it's very gray with the new constitutional standards. I know that members of the House, I'll let this House speak for the House. What I know is that members of the Senate want to create safe communities. And we believe that clarifying the standards from the uncertainty that was created by the Supreme Court about whether someone should feel comfortable with the knowledge that we are going to see more and more guns in our community, in child care centers, in churches, in nursing homes. That's just not the right approach from my perspective, and I think a lot of members of the Senate agree. We have to do it in a constitutional way to make sure that people are thoughtful. I suspect that we're going to have robust conversations in the Senate before a bill moves about how best to create a framework for the state of Maryland that makes sure that Marylanders are safe.
But have you had conversations, maybe not even with just the House Speaker, with maybe Chair Clippinger about what you anticipate this?
I have a great deal of respect for my delegate. He's a wonderful individual. And yes, we've talked about it. It's I think that there are going to be a lot of different perspectives, and it's going to be the legislative process that works its way through on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Excellent. Thank you all. Have a great weekend.